I'm Dr. Khalilah Harris with The Real News. Over the course of the next year, we'll be recording interviews with candidates for political office. We'll be asking them about progressive policies for education and their thoughts on how we make sure that all of America's youth have access to high-quality schools. Stay tuned. So why don't we start with education? Okay. You are a progressive candidate for mayor of Chicago. You are a former, well, no one's ever a former educator. You're an educator, school leader, union man working to support school leaders in Chicago. Will you talk a little bit about progressive education policies? What's critical for people to understand about how policies impact everyday people and their children to be able to achieve a high quality education? And what should progressive candidates be pushing forward for people to understand that they are candidates that they should support?
So you said it in your comments, enable people to live their best life. I say something similar to it. I say enable people to live up to their full potential. And so education, all policies should contribute to that ultimate goal, people living up to their full potential. And education, you know, the thing that gets spoken about the least, but is the most important in education, is the development of the human brain. It is the most important thing that people talk the least about. And so when we know that, and we also know that the most critical years in terms of that development are from conception to the age of 3, that means starting the conversation there to make sure that, and I say that because I was the principal or the assistant principal at a school in North Lawndale in Chicago, West Side, predominantly Black community, low income. I was also the principal in Lakeview at a school called Blaine, wealthy area, predominantly white. And my kids in North Lawndale would come to school on day 1 of kindergarten, 2-3 years behind my kids at Blaine. It's day 1 of kindergarten. You know, and they call Johnson a failing school. How's it a failing school and they're 2 years behind on day 1 of kindergarten? They've been failed long before they've ever reached the school system.
Yeah, I like to reject the whole failing school idea.
Right.
Because schools are inanimate objects.
Right.
So the last time I checked, they can't fail anyone. What about the adults? What are their responsibilities for our children?
Right, which adults though? So when they say failing schools, what they're trying to say are failing public school teachers or failing public school administrators. But again, it's day 1 of kindergarten and they're already 2 years behind.
Right.
How have they been failed by a teacher and they've never seen a teacher?
Right.
And so that says that should cause us some pause to look at, you know, what is going on here? Because when you look at what happens with those kids at Johnson and those kids at Blaine, right? They start off like this. In Chicago public schools, those kids at Johnson grow 6 years in 5. And so the school system produces academic growth in these kids beyond expectations, but it also produces academic growth in the ones that started out ahead of them. And so the school system and the people in that system, at least in terms of, you know, the measures they use, which are reading and math test scores, which I think are way too narrow, but that's what we have right now. And according to those measures, the school system is doing a phenomenal job in terms of taking kids where they find them and building them up. But if you want to eliminate that gap, you know, you're either going to stop these kids so they can catch up, and that's not going to happen. So the only reasonable thing to do is think about how do we create a system where these kids don't show up behind? And that means looking at housing. That means looking at lead paint. In Chicago, for example, if you are in Lincoln Park, you have a 0% chance of being exposed to lead paint. If you live in North Lawndale or Austin, your chances of being exposed to lead paint are 1 in 4. Right, and so these kids have been failed by the people who are supposed to be ensuring that folks have safe housing, failed by the politicians, failed by the business community, the rental community, the private rental market. These kids are exposed to violence and the trauma that violence causes. Again, going back to brain development, right, and the trauma that violence causes and the impact that it has on brain function. They are failed by our failure as a society to make sure their communities and families have what they need to give them an environment to grow up in that stimulates cognitive development. They're failed by the fact that their parents don't have income that is adequate, like those parents in Lakeview have, an income that enables them to expose their children to things that stimulate and nurture good cognitive development. And so with that said, under my administration, with that as a focus, that means making sure that every mother has not just access, but actually has strong prenatal care so that we can eliminate and reduce the chances and probability of these children being born, behind in terms of some cognitive function or cognitive deficit that could have been prevented as a result of some problem during pregnancy. It means that once they're born, making sure that their parents have the resources to create strong, socially supportive environments, cognitively stimulating environments in their home, where they may get intense support, 12 visits in the first year of life, maybe 6 visits in the second year of life, to enable them to set up an environment in the home. Everything from having literature to the kind of parent-to-child interactions and deep communications that stimulate the kind of cognitive development that the kids in Lakeview often get, that the kids in North Lawndale sometimes don't, or less likely to get.
So how would you pay for that, right? People would say, and often the critique of progressive candidates is that you have great ideas, who's supposed to pay for that and how?
Well, it's funny because when Republicans have bad ideas, nobody asks them how they're going to pay for them. When they want to go off to war and spend $1 trillion destabilizing the world, no one says, how are you going to pay for it? And so I have to start with that, surfacing the hypocrisy. But underneath it, there is often a legitimate question. But I don't think the question is legitimate for most quarters that the question comes from. But for those who ask the legitimate question, there are many different proposals, but most of the best ones have one common element. So, for example, in Chicago, they talk about a progressive state income tax, and the city would, of course, benefit from that, taxing those who have more at higher rates. They talk about a LaSalle Street tax. LaSalle Street is sort of like Chicago's Wall Street, right? And so they talk about a LaSalle Street tax on financial transactions, a corporate head tax, getting revenue from the 5% of the highest earners. But they all have one thing in common that no one wants to actually say, which is tax the rich, right? We have to get away from revenue systems that punish working people and punish poor people. And so that general spirit, whatever the revenue source, it has to have that general spirit to it for me to support it, that we have to get the revenue from where the revenue is. We have an economic system that funnels wealth into places where it's kept, right? Where it's not redistributed, where it doesn't get invested back into the economy. We have to have a revenue system that compels the people who were once collecting that wealth to bring that wealth back down into the economy through the government and government programs and hiring that would take place with that revenue.
Would you support the redistribution of taxes in terms of education? So in other words, that property taxes not be the driver behind funding schools, and instead taxes are collected and then distributed in an equitable way across schools?
Absolutely. In Chicago and Illinois is probably the most inequitable. We rely, in terms of the percentage of funds that come from the state to fund our schools versus the percentage of funds that come from local property taxes, we have the most inequitable system. So there's a heavy reliance on local property taxes in Illinois. Strangely enough, though, Chicago, we have wealthy properties and we have not so expensive properties. So it actually comes out as a wash. We actually spend more per child, $2,000 more per child than the state average. So we should be doing okay. But when you look at our staffing, the inequity in the funding formula isn't our main problem, because when you look at our staffing, there are 858 districts in the state of Illinois. Chicago's ranked 857 in the ratio of staff per student. How can you be above average in funding and the worst in the state in staffing? It makes absolutely no sense. So what that means on a school level is that in an average Illinois school that has 600 kids, that school has 59 staff members. The average Chicago school with 600 kids has 37 staff members. That's 22 fewer staff than the average Illinois school, which means each one of those staff that provides a service in the average Illinois school is not there to provide that service to Chicago students. So if you're above average in funding, dead last in staffing, that says you're not spending your money on what you should be spending your money on. Something corrupt is happening behind the scenes. And when you look at how our money flows in Chicago, you can actually see the corruption. Chicago Tribune did a front page story on our mayor, showed that his top 60 campaign donors all got some kind of financial benefit or contract from either the school district or the city as a result of having donated to his campaign. We have hundreds of millions of dollars going to a private custodial company right now that left our schools filthy. Right? This made national news. This was in the Sun-Times, the Tribune, the Washington Post, left our schools filthy, and they're getting hundreds of millions of dollars and just got their contract extended after the news came out that they left our schools filthy. Why? Because one of the companies gave a $250,000 campaign contribution to our mayor. And so even though the funding, and getting back to your question, is inequitable, that's not Chicago's problem. Chicago's problem is corruption.
And how the money is spent.
And how it's spent.
So you and I have talked before about the recent report and expose on sexual assault of students that is connected to understaffing and the way that the central office is vetting candidates or failing to vet candidates. When you talk about the impacts of corruption on schools and staffing, you also talked with me before about the differences in resources that some schools have versus other schools. How do you close that gap? How do you lift up those inequities and position all schools to be able to have same access to high quality coursework, high quality educators, and enough educators to implement those programs?
So this is part two of our previous question in terms of the education system in general. Part one was conception to the age of 3, and then of course pre-K follows that. Part two is, what do we do in the actual school system? So we get them to school ready to learn, on par with everybody else. What do we do once we get them to the school system? So number one is instruction, right? When we start talking about brain development, there are also research, proven, evidence-based practices, things that we understand about how the mind works. And as a result of understanding those things, we know how to best teach children most effectively. It means developing the capacity of teachers to understand that research base and then use instructional strategies that capitalize on that understanding. Basically, professional development. If you're a doctor, right, one of the foundational things that you have to continue to go back to is the physiology and the biology and the chemistry of the human body. You have to understand that, and then based on that understanding, what are the medical practices that best enable you to capitalize on your ability to heal that body? In education, it's not like that. We don't ground the way we develop our teachers in how the human mind and the brain functions, right? Everything's a gimmick or everything's some market-based approach that if we just tested them more often, or if we give competition, somehow teachers are going to magically understand the human brain a little bit better and be able to teach better. No, we have to approach it the same way we approach medicine because it's just as important. We have to greatly increase the capacity of teachers by giving them continuous opportunities to engage in professional development, to learn from best practice, to learn from one another, and to actually give them time during the school day to do that, free up professional development and learning time. So that's number one. The second piece is curriculum. So there's instruction, then there's curriculum. My son right now he goes to public school, but it's the summer, so public school's out. So we had to care for him. So he goes to the University of Chicago Lab School for the summer. This is a private school that Rahm sends his kids to. Our mayor, Rahm Emanuel, sends his kids there. The first day I picked my son up, I picked him up from the Gordon Parks Media Lab, the state-of-the-art center. And he's in 5th grade, and he's learning documentary film production in 5th grade. And so I go and look at their syllabus. They also have world languages from 3rd through 8th grade. You master a world language from 3rd through 8th grade. Mandarin, French, Spanish, German, Russian. There is theater. There is sculpting, not just art, sculpture is a class. They learn painting. They have a deep civics education, right? This is the kind of education you give people who you want to lead the world. But they give us the kind of education that you give to people you want to follow the children who you plan on leading this world. And so, getting back to your question, an equitable, high-quality education means lifting up teachers' capacity to teach, but also lifting up the curriculum that we expose our young people to, like giving them a lead the world education, not a sharecropper education.
And so, when we look at the onslaught of artificial intelligence and technology and the ways in which, our children won't have the same types of jobs that we were looking towards, right? Many of the jobs that we see today will be wiped out. And you talk about schools that that develop creators and that develop workers. How do we engage community in the type of policy making that will lift up that dynamic, that will make sure that parents and community members are clear they should be demanding the types of opportunities that the students at the lab school have for students who are in the average neighborhood public school?
So the process you're asking about goes beyond schools, right? It's how do we get people engaged in the political process in general so that they can have a stake in what housing looks like, so they can have a stake in what economic development looks like, and what they can have a stake in what education looks like. I actually have told people that the way, like this candidacy for mayor, like the way we do it, all of us do it, is backwards. We have organizations in Chicago that have been advocating for affordable housing. We have organizations and leaders in Chicago that have been advocating for education-based issues. We've been having organizations that advocate for fair immigration policies. And you see a lot of these same people at one another's event. There is a progressive community in Chicago that is organized around their issues, but they are not as organized as they should be around putting people in place in our government. So they're organized around telling the existing government what the government should be doing, and then they're used to getting having the government slam the door in their faces. Right? It seems to me that at some point there should be a coalition built among these organizations where they begin to develop talent, political talent, and the people who are often out there speaking on behalf of these issues and articulating these issues and working with people and organizing people should be the people that they are grooming collectively to run for public office. It hit me at the 2015 elections, right afterwards when Chuy Garcia lost. I don't know if people know, but Chuy only campaigned for about 3 months. He decided in like November, and our elections are in February, right? He decided in late October, November to run. We can't expect to have a realistic shot at winning the mayor's office if the only choice we had decided to run 3 months before the election. We have to be involved in not only the process of advocating for our issues, but making sure someone is developed and groomed in an ongoing way so that when election season comes around, we just sort of put ourselves in the positions of having to choose from the people who step up and not putting people in place to step up.
And what would your role as mayor be in that? How would you support that kind of cultivation of community voice?
And so it starts with the campaign. And so one of the things that we're doing is we're having people's assemblies. We are trying to connect with, and we started with economic development and housing. And our mayor is such a vindictive prick that I can't even mention the names of the organizations that we're partnering with for fear. And they've said that they think that if they are known to be connected with a challenger to Rahm Emanuel, then a relationship they have with the city will be cut off. But we've reached out to organizations, and many have responded to us reaching out. And we're developing our platform in concert with them, with their advice, with their consultation. And so we have to do that in housing. We have to do that in education. We have to do that in economic development. The brilliance of our city is the key. I'm not the key. I don't care how many bright ideas, I don't care how many bright ideas I have or my campaign has. When we get in that office, we're going to need some political will and power. We're going to need hundreds and thousands and hundreds of thousands of people who, when the alderman doesn't want to vote the right way because of his campaign donor, can descend upon that alderman's office to let him know he's being watched, right? And so we have to build coalitions to develop the platform that we run on, but we also have to maintain those coalitions once we get in office, because without them, we're not going to be able to get the 26 votes in the city council needed to do anything, or we're not going to be able to pressure the state legislature to do what it needs to do to send resources back to Chicago, or we're not going to be able to pressure our congressmen to do what they need to do in Washington, D.C.
Right.
To bring resources back to Chicago. Did that answer your question?
It did. I want to shift gears a second and talk a little bit about a new pilot that's being discussed in Chicago in terms of universal basic income. We see cities like Stockton in California, and we see countries like Finland who have launched or are about to launch experiments there. In Chicago, I think the goal is to give 1,000 families $500 a month, no strings attached. What's your take on universal basic income and its capacity to lift people out of poverty and really have them be a part of the economy?
So people need a set of things to survive in this world. They need food, they need clothing, they need shelter, they need healthcare, they need education. And all of those things primarily depend on having the income. Absent public education or good public education or universal healthcare, you need an income to get them. And so to the extent that universal basic income is designed to make sure you get those things, I support it. But you see this philosophy and this push coming from all sides of the political spectrum. And when you begin to see that, you have to ask more questions. And so in terms of what is most of these are positioned as pilots. So when you have a pilot, typically there's some kind of assessment. What are you assessing? In Canada, I think it was Dauphin, one of the things they evaluated it on was whether or not while you were getting this income, you furthered your education. And it turns out people did. People went to school more. Did you spend more time with your family? That was actually a goal of theirs. Is that our goal? Typically it is not, but when it is, I support it. So how will they be evaluating those things? And that family thing is very important, particularly when you have so many mothers in the workplace. We've actually done universal income in some ways. My own mother never worked a day in her life. My mother was white, lived on welfare, single mother, and Social Security from my father was a lot older than her. He was like 55 when I was born. And so we got Social Security from him at a very early age. And so she pretty much had this very low basic income, but worked her behind off, cleaning up after us, keeping the house clean, cooking, making sure we had resources in the public sphere that we needed to have. When one of my brothers had issues, making sure he was able to get the mental health support that he needed. She worked. She was able to spend a lot of time advocating for us. So despite the fact that we grew up in abject poverty, all 5 of us are doing fairly well as adults, because whether they recognize it or not, my mother had the resources to do this extremely important job. How are we positioning that job, for example, in this push for universal basic income? Is that going to be a measurement? And again, to the extent that it will be, I support it. I guess the third thing I would talk about here is, in this situation in particular, is this meaningful or is it a political election year gimmick made to look good at election time? And the way I look at that, I have something I call the Ferris wheel test. In Chicago, there's a scandal that's fairly well known. $55 million in tax increment finance money was funneled to Navy Pier. our tourist attraction in Chicago. It's like the biggest tourist attraction we have. TIF money is supposed to be spent in blighted neighborhoods to create economic development. Navy Pier is probably the most developed. It's in the central business district. TIF money had no business being spent there, let alone $55 million on one project, and most of it going to a Ferris wheel. Now, take that and hold it up against the mayor's Neighborhood Opportunity Fund, which is supposed to fund economic development on the entire South Side and the entire West Side. That's two of the three sides of the city. The east side is Lake Michigan, so we have three sides. So 2/3 of the city, economic development. They spent $55 million on the Ferris wheel. How much do you think has been spent on the entire South Side and the entire West Side? And they have press conferences on this too, as if they're doing something great. $11 million, right? 5 times more than that on one project. We're not even counting the hundreds of millions spent downtown outside the Ferris wheel. 5 times as much on a Ferris wheel than spent on the entire South, Southwest, and West sides of the city. And so when you see that, we see this as an election year gimmick. There's no real investment. This is, I want to do a press conference to say I did something, and nothing more. And I think this universal basic income experiment is supposed to be $6 million.
How do you form a pilot
when you look at the Ferris wheel test,
Yes.
it doesn't pass.
Yes, I get you.
Right.
Let's talk about charter schools.
Sure.
Charter proponents would say that they are targeted at expanding equitable access to high quality schools for students. What is your take on charter schools and the role that they play in reforming and improving education in a way that impacts all students versus just a few?
So rather than talking about charters as a body, I like to talk about the practices and outcomes associated with charters. And to the extent that a particular charter engages in these practices, I am either for or against it. And so when we looked at academic growth of students in charter schools, for example, we found that although a charter might look like they're comparable in terms of overall test scores, when we look at where students started and then look at how much they grew, they pale in comparison to public schools. So there's less academic growth in Chicago's charter schools. We looked at a test called the MAP test, a measure of academic progress that actually measures student growth from one year to the next. The charters averaged the 48th percentile in student growth, and our neighborhood schools were at the 75th. This was in 2014. So that's problematic. So to the extent that you have a system like that, and it's for Black and brown children, that means you're sending the kids who need the most growth because they're already behind, and you're sending them into the schools that produce the least growth, while you have white and Asian students and well-off students who typically, who are already at the top, who are still in the public system that's producing the most growth. So what's going to happen there if Black and brown students are in the charters with the least growth? That gap grows, right? And that's exactly what happens. So look at the national data. What city was ground zero for school choice? Milwaukee, right? The vouchers and the charters. What is it, 30 years ago, right? And so if in Milwaukee and Wisconsin in general, that gap closed, then we can say, oh, the charters did what they were supposed to do. If it increased, there's a problem. Well, guess what state now has the largest achievement gap in the nation? Wisconsin. And so we see, 1, less student growth. We see, 2, associated with charters, an exacerbation of the academic achievement gap. That's problematic. So to the extent that you associate it with the things that create that, I can't support it. Number 3, we see an abuse of the expulsion and suspension process. In Chicago, there is a charter whose expulsion rate is 251 times the district average. Not 251%, 251 times. Right? To the extent that you abuse the expulsion process to get rid of students you don't want, I cannot support you. 4th, there is hypersegregation associated with charters. So typically charters will have poor kids And the public schools will have the poorest kids. And so the charters are able to say, well, we have low-income kids. We have kids who qualify for free and reduced lunch. What you find when you look in the data is they have most of the kids who qualify for reduced price lunch, and the public schools have most of the kids who qualify for free lunch, which means their incomes are averaging at the charters about $25,000 per family, and at the public schools, their incomes are averaging $5,000. And so you know where the students with the most need are, who will likely have suffered the impact of having lived in such poverty. They're in our public system. And then now you're segregating them with this lottery enrollment process from the kids they need to be around, who are maybe in impoverished conditions, but have not suffered as much as they have.
Where their families have more engagement in the process to even enter the charter.
Exactly. So to the extent that a charter does not get academic growth, to the extent that a charter exacerbates the achievement gap, to the extent that a charter exacerbates segregation, right? Now it's not only racial segregation, now it's income segregation within the same race. To the extent that they abuse the expulsion system, I cannot support them. That said, most charters engage in those things. There's some that don't. To the extent that you don't, more power to you. To the extent that you do, you have to be stopped.
So what do you say to the families who would say, as a Black man, you should not be stopping me from exercising choice of where my student goes to, that Black families?
I think they're absolutely right. I shouldn't be stopping you from exercising choice. My point is that government should not be subsidizing poor options. Right? Government money should not be spent subsidizing a system that produces poor results. They can go off and start their own thing. And if you want to choose to go and spend your money at that thing, at that inferior option, go ahead. But government should not be subsidizing it.
Thank you. That's a good note to end on.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.